Cool. Good evening. Hello everyone on Play Chess and on Twitch TV, kingscrusher. So I thought we'd carry on from last week to have a look at Nottingham 1936 round 2. I think it was one of the most important tournaments up until that time in 1936 because there were so many world champions, and I didn't really particularly emphasise the rise of Botvinnik, but within the evolution of style, I believe Botvinnik plays a very powerful role because the USSR was a major force in world chess, and that was partly driven actually politically. Chess was used to demonstrate political ideals. And there are certain players that, such as Botvinnik, which were backed by the state, and it's arguable that a lot of opportunities came Botvinnik's way. So we see 1936 is the start of Botvinnik proving himself to be worth the backing of the state, and so this is a particularly important tournament from that point of view. So stylistically, you can look at other players that were really good, as well as Botvinnik. For example, Paul Kers, he won the Avro 1938 tournament 2 years after this tournament, but then we had World War II. Is Kers worthy of study? Yes. Is he world championship material? Potentially. He deserved a shot at the title from Alexander Alekhine. But then, if we want to look at the best potential styles of players, what about poor old Capablanca? He was denied a rematch. Well, in round 2, actually Capablanca got a kind of rematch, playing white against Alexander Alekhine. So this is the first time they had encountered each other since their World Championship match, which Alekhine then proceeded to play other people after. So a historic encounter in round 2. You have a lot of commenting on this game on places like Chess Games Comment because of its historical importance. So very historically important. But if you want to determine the best styles, there's these influences, not just political culture, where you have players obscured like Paul Kers and then later Bronstein, who are world championship caliber, but you also have players that deserved a rematch. So a lot of players around this time are probably deserving the study from a stylistic point of view. Okay, so let's look at Capablanca. So he was more of the classical mould. He didn't really, I think, study the hypermoderns or take them too seriously. He played classically in this game with d4. Alexander Alekhine played e6, as though there might be a sort of Nimzo-Indian invitation potentially if c4. But actually Capablanca just plays knight f3. I don't know if this infuriated Alekhine already. He wanted to play dynamically, aggressively, and he plays what we consider nowadays to be a bit of a dodgy opening, the Dutch defence, f5. Okay, but it's against knight f3. It's avoiding a lot of the gambits like the Staunton gambit. So white now plays again classical move g3. So Capablanca is securing his king side, and you'll see actually white play in this game looks fairly modern against this Dutch defence setup, and it looks to be a stonewalled setup configuration here. Bishop e7. White hasn't moved the c pawn, so any checks that you could just play c3 here. So bishop e7, both sides now castle. Okay, but now we get some deviation from what we kind of understand from a modern stone wall opening. Black would normally, want to construct a pawn chain like this, and then do something about the bishop like this. But we see here knight e4. So it looks a bit unusual to play knight e4 so quickly here. So what is Alexander up to? Capablanca's response is actually kind of tactical and positional at the same time. The move here that Capablanca plays is actually Queen B3, believe it or not. And this does crop up as an idea in modern variations. It's putting pressure on the queen side, and maybe it's supporting d5 later. It's quite a nuisance basically for inhibiting black's development. And there's this question about this diagonal as well being a bit sensitive. Okay, Alexander responds with bishop f6, and now we see rook d1, as though really this rook is ready to support d5 as well. Queen e8, and a slight snag with this whole setup here. It looks a bit on the optimistic side, but in particular the c7 square is often a bit of a pain in this type of position, and in fact knight c3 not only challenges the knight a little bit, there's also a nuisance threat potentially of knight b5, forcing black into some sort of contortion against that. And in fact black doesn't seem to mind now this problem, this knight b5 issue. Black plays actually knight c6. Okay, and Capablanca just reacts with knight b5, so the bishop's pulled back now just to defend c7, bishop d8. Okay, and interestingly, this is quite an interesting move actually. What do you think white plays now? Because it looks as though white was geared up to do something with the queen on this diagonal, and I've hinted at d5s and stuff. For those of you on PlayChess, please can you hide the game score? This is quite interesting. Maybe, you know, Capablanca is pleased with this configuration of the knight on c6 and the bishop on d8. Can you guess a quiet positional move for white in this position? If I give you 20 seconds. So a quiet positional move. Maybe Alexander Alekhine was expecting d5. It's not d5. I'll give you a clue. It's not d5. Anyone? Well, okay. I think maybe, okay, one of the ideas of this, it's a quite subtle positional move. It's maybe preparing d5. Capablanca simply plays queen c2. Perhaps, you know, he wants to play d5 without any knight c5 on his queen. So queen c2 looks as though d5 is on the cards again. So he's provoked black into this fairly passive configuration. It doesn't look like a normal kind of aggressive Dutch defense for a moment. And white's, you know, really geared up for this d5 here. And in fact, d5 from black doesn't look particularly appetizing. If black had to play d5 here, he'd be leaving a gaping hole on e5 perhaps. And then maybe bishop f4 is pretty nasty. You can imagine this sort of position, maybe bishop f4. And it's just unpleasant. Alexander plays actually d6, so he's keeping fluid, and he's provoking Capablanca to play d5. Hi, playing the game on stream. Yeah, Nottingham 1936 round 2. We have a classic epic encounter between Capablanca playing white and Alekhine playing black. One of the highlights, I think, of this tournament, well, especially round 2. So d5, because actually, if I haven't mentioned it before. There were rumours, well, more than just rumours, but Alexander Alekhine was sort of bad-mouthing apparently Capablanca and didn't want to play in the same tournament as him and was demanding extra prize money if he was going to be in the same tournament, and also claimed as world champion, of course, that he added status to any tournament. It was very, very difficult for these two guys to meet in tournaments, basically. So this was the first encounter since the World Championship. Now white here looks better after d5. White is simply better. What is actually black doing? His knights are getting pushed around. We see knight b4, and the queen simply returns back now to b3, not minding, okay, giving up the c5 square. Seems to be some sort of positional concession. Okay, so we see knight a6 as though black's optimistically going to use that c5 square. Okay, but what about this diagonal now? Is this slightly improving the configuration? This reverberating queen has done some positional damage. Surely D takes E6, and we see if bishop takes E6, then maybe something like knight D4 is annoying here. If bishop E6 immediately, maybe knight D4 potentially is good. There might be stronger moves, but we see knight AC5 kicking the queen again, and it goes back to C2. Okay, and then actually now there's an option to take with a knight, which is taken. Knight takes E6. Knight FD4. Okay, challenging this, and there's a potential tactic here of knight takes F5, I think, because of bishop takes E4. That knight's a bit of a tactical liability at the moment. So Alekhine exchanges on D4, and again potentially this knight's a problem, but at the moment, okay, this pawn's holding this configuration together, and we see bishop F6, and the knight now goes to B5 to harass that poor C7 pawn again. Queen E7, and actually it looks like if it would be worse if this pawn was here, because then C6 we've got potentially a D6 problem. This knight safeguarding black's position. Well, actually bishop E3 almost gives the idea, well, actually this pawn's under fire now. Okay, so A6, knight D4, bishop D7. Now simply rook AC1. So it looks like white's development looks kind of harmonic, and it looks as though C5 is stopped at the moment with this knight on E4. Okay, rook AE8 is played, but now white's strategic break still does remain, it seems, to be B4 and C5, and he plays actually B4. He really wants to strike with C5. B6, trying to stop that. Okay, and now this causes some issues for black. A simple retreating knight move, knight F3, because basically it's uncovering the pressure of the bishop, which is supporting C5. So why is the C5 break so effective potentially in this position? Well, you can imagine structurally these pawns are going to be diced. You can imagine potentially an isolated A pawn, doubled C pawns, and something really horrible as a result of C5 here is on the cards. And there's a bit of a panicky reaction to this now, which is kind of calmly refuted, really. Okay, so the question is here, sorry, Falbeno, could black stop C5 with C5 here himself? This is a very good question. Can we stop this C5 break? So, okay, let's have a look at C5. Is there any problem? Potentially that looks like a reasonable move in the circumstance. Possibly this was one of the better moves available to black. I can't see an immediate refutation myself, unless anyone else can. Can anyone see why this would be a problem for black? It does weaken the D5 square bit positioning. There's nothing guarding D5 now. This is a bit of a backward pawn. Maybe just positioning knight FD2 is more comfortable for white, just to play on this pawn. You know, if say this position, this looks nasty on D6, and if black leaves that, it looks structured as though there's a problem anyway for D6 to play C5. It's quite committal anyway. But Alekhine's move is knight C3, and this doesn't. This looks, you know, a very, very tactical move. Okay, which has got a very, very interesting tactical point to it, for sure. And the point of it is revealed here if well, first of all, knight c3 attacks the rook, and also bishop a4 is on the cards, threatening a skewer. Okay, so Capablanca simply plays rook d3, so he's bypassed that skewer, or has he? Is bishop a4 on the cards? Well, actually there might be something like queen d2 there on bishop a4, but actually Alekhine now played f4, and he's going in for this skewer. Now Capablanca simply accepts this skewer possibility. He takes on f4, and after bishop f5, interestingly, it's not so clear cut that he's just losing the exchange. Capablanca simply plays queen d2, so threatening to take this, of course. So black takes, and now e takes d3 covers up the e4 square. The knight's not retreating like this now, and interestingly, in this position, it's problematic for this knight. You would think the knight might want to play knight a4. Now if this was the case, I believe knight g5 is a strong move here, because white carries the threat of bishop c6 now, and this starts to be really quite unpleasant for black. It's very unpleasant. So maybe Alekhine senses something's gone quite wrong here, and he just accepts actually being material down now. Alekhine plays plays c5 now, so he's losing 2 pieces for a rook. So rook takes c3, bishop takes c3, queen takes c3. Okay, so we've actually got 3 of these minor pieces for the 2 heavy rooks. Can white coordinate these minor pieces here? Queen f6, queen takes f6, and this is pretty nasty stuff. Rook takes f6 is not played rather, but g takes f6. These pawns are pretty fragmented by taking like this. Knight d2, f5, b5. This bishop's got a beautiful diagonal. a5, knight f1. The knight is now coming to put pressure on f5. King f7, knight g3, the king protects. Bishop f3 threatening a skewer. Rook e7 getting out of the way. King f1, king f6. And after king f6, just bishop d2 now protects e1 and threatens bishop c3. King g6 is played. And this is a really dire position now after a4. And it seems Alekhine didn't really like this position at all. White is actually threatening h4 and h5, and this f5 is really precariously protected. It's going to drop off at some point. Something's going to drop off here, because this bishop's going to be on this diagonal, and f5 is a massive liability. And in fact, Alekhine didn't like his position to the extent that he resigned here. Alekhine resigned here. So this was a very happy day for Capablanca to finally get the chance to play Alekhine again. And it does look pretty lost, but you might be surprised that the game didn't carry on from here. But I think white can systematically improve his position. On the engine variations I was checking for this game, a plan, even if f5 is not immediately dropping off, might be just bishop c3, then playing for d4, bishop d5, planting a bishop on e6, then d5 is nasty. There's all sorts of nasty plans here, but basically there's nothing the rooks can do. They have no entry points into white's position, so this is actually lost in the long run. But yeah, it's a bit of an early resign at move 38. Okay, so that was a highlight actually game of round 2. Should we have a look at that again to see what happened again? Capablanca's style was classical, and Alekhine's was kind of attacking and trying to be dynamic, but it seems yeah, knight e4 was sidestepped. Of course, black would want to maybe consider doubling the pawns on knight c3. So I guess this is inhibiting knight c3 and preparing something like bishop f6. But this queen b3 has a lot of stuff going on for it. It vacates that d1 square, importantly, so this idea of d5 becomes more effectual. So rook d1, queen e8, that neglects the c7 pawn, and so knight c3 is with greater effect, this actual threat of knight b5 to drive the bishop back. Black never really got an attack in this game, so the bishop was driven back, and the queen, you know, you'd think d5, but the queen's getting out of the way of knight c5s with tempo. There is an interest in playing now d5 here, and what we get structurally is this position where white really wants to achieve this c5 break at some point, and it eventually transpires that the c5 break is really on the cards pretty soon. Now, in fact, white's putting maximum power behind the c5 break structurally, and now b4 for that c5 break. Black tries to put a break on it, the c5 break, knight f3, and then this strange knight c3, which completely doesn't do black any favours. Okay, white loses both rooks but collects 3 minor pieces for it because of this knight c3. As mentioned, yeah, c5 might be a viable alternative here, but it might have its own issues structurally as well. So okay, so we see knight c3 and we lose 1 rook here and another rook, but we've collected 3 minor pieces from black, so that's pretty cool. And in fact, the point about this position, now here rook takes f6 is also interesting to consider. I guess Alekhine wasn't too keen on this position either. Maybe something like knight g5 is dangerous, followed by knight e4, or bishop d5 is dangerous. There are all sorts of dangerous things, but this pawn was actually a bit of a lemon pawn on f5 as well. So black hasn't got any entry points with the rooks. The way Capablanca plays this, he realizes the rooks need entry points, and the position is actually becoming very blocked here. And it's ideal actually for the minor pieces to live in this position, it seems. Okay, so in fact here, okay, so Alekhine resigned. Alright, let's go on to another game now in round 2. So I wanted to track Mikhail Botvinnik because, as I say, I think he plays a pivotal role in our perception of the strongest players of all time. I mean, he did successfully defend his World Championship title as well a number of times, but here was the early Mikhail Botvinnik. Okay, so against Reuben Fine, who was one of the strongest players of the time as well, a very fine player, Reuben Fine. So knight f3, we see actually a double fianchetto system emerging after c4 takes knight a3. White's got a slight plus from this opening but plays b3, and we see black constructing against this bishop to blot out the bishop on the diagonal. So bishop b2 e5. The downside with black structure here is these light squares generally. If white can get rid of this bishop, but also if black castling on this side, then h7 is a bit more vulnerable than usual. It's a target potentially, so it's something to bear in mind on this structure. So g3, bishop g2, knight d5, and in fact this setup with black looks like a reverse kind of Botvinnik system against the English. This bind on d4 looks like something Botvinnik would play himself later. So bishop e7, and we see knight h4, and it looks as though there's potentially pressure on this diagonal So this bishop coming to e4 is potentially useful. The knight's holding up against f5 potentially. So we see some venom with the simple move queen b1 here, believe it or not. Because in this position, bishop e4 is more effective than usual with the knight here, holding up f5 from black. So black has to do something about this simple idea of bishop e4 here. This could run into very, very serious trouble otherwise. Black plays rook f7. Okay. So I guess now bishop e4 is answerable with something like g6. It should be okay. I would hope. My intuitive assessment's okay there. But white played actually knight f5. Okay. We see bishop e6. And now trying to break this kind of bind on d4, Botvinnik plays f4, and he's also trying to increase the number of central pawns he's got. So e takes f4, g takes f4. Looks initially like a positional success. White's dragged a pawn to the center. He's broke this bind a little bit, but you know he's got some weaknesses in this position. Knight b6 is played here, and we see bishop e4. Interesting move, offering up c4 here. Okay, so what could white have done here? He doesn't really want to give too much dynamic play to black, so possibly he rejected knight takes b6, just thinking possibly a takes. Black's still got a kind of bind on the d4 square, doesn't seem too bad here. So we see this move bishop e4, and black seems to take the right way. He plays bishop takes c4. If he takes with knight takes c4, then I guess this is a bit dangerous because of knight e3 on h7 and c4. That's potentially quite nasty, I would guess. So actually we see bishop takes c4, b takes, and knight takes c4. So what is this pawn sacrifice about exactly? Why did Botvinnik sacrifice a pawn here? Well, bishop c3, he's got a lot of pressure now. Maybe he's threatening even queen takes b7. But black, it's black's move. Black with the move plays a dynamic move. He can afford to give back a pawn as well. He's a pawn up. So Reuben fine plays knight d4. Okay, he's on e2. Now, white's position doesn't look too convincing here. Maybe this isn't such a hot position for white. I don't know what you guys think. If I gave you 20 seconds to evaluate this position, do you think it's good for white or good for black? So I'll give you 20 seconds here to check this out. If you have any reasons as well, that'd be great if you want to mention them. Anyone? Any evaluation here? Looks black. Does black look better? Sorry, effort. Playing the game, white has the potential to kick with the centre pawn. Yeah. Okay. White gave up. Well, sorry. In this position, knight takes d4 was played, which does mean the h7 pawn is going to be won here, potentially, and it is taken. And we see actually king f8. Very, very good idea, king f8, because I think king h8 is potentially quite troublesome. Maybe Botvinnik could consider a hack attack at some point with queen. Well, queen g6 immediately looks pretty dangerous to me on that rook with crude ideas. So the king going to f8 seems a safer bet. And now bishop b4. Okay. And black plays a kind of liberating type move again. Black plays d3. So he's giving himself a lot of tactical play. You know, this diagonal, this bishop's loose now. White takes on e7. Rook takes. So black is like sacrificing a pawn, trying to damage white's structure in the centre. And there's pressure on e2. And what's this bishop doing on h7? It's like Botvinnik's all over the place in this game. This is the early Botvinnik. He hasn't quite maybe evolved just yet into a total monster. But he seems to be, he has to try and cling on. He plays queen takes d3. Have exchange of queens. E takes d3, which looks horrible for the double pawns. But if he plays bishop takes d3, what would be the problem? I guess black has simply knight takes d2 is okay. So we see e takes d3. And one of the points here, at least this pawn can try and trap the knight. If knight takes d2, maybe something like rook f2 here. Where is this knight going? It's run out of squares. It hasn't got any square. Okay, so the knight here goes to b6. Okay, white is a pawn up, but these pawns look a bit ugly here. Bishop e4, rook d8, rook c1, knight d5. a3, keeping the knight out of b4, otherwise d3 would be a problem. King g2, the king maybe comes to try and safeguard f4, so the rook's now free to move. King e3, okay, white's okay, even though he's got the double pawns, he's holding this position surely. Knight c5, f5, rook g2, and they start to repeat here. Rook c4, breaking the repeat. But after rook f4 d6, they peacefully agreed a draw. Now, it wasn't the most exciting game. You might wonder, why on earth did I show you this game? As I say, I think Botvinnik's an important character in the evolution of chess style. This was a great tournament for him overall. And a lot of people seem to believe that his strategic grip style of play is potentially stronger because he had that World Championship title for so long, potentially stronger than Paul Keres and Bronstein. Personally, I don't believe so. I believe personally Paul Keres and David Bronstein were just as good or stronger than Mikhail Botvinnik because they were very creative, dynamic players. I think creativity in chess counts for a great deal. So I don't actually believe, just because he was world champion so many times, that he should be like the model player, that many people just look at the world champions would arrive at that conclusion. But this wasn't a great representation of his style, because he did do well overall in this tournament. But I really believe Paul Keres, as we'll see later in the series, Avro 1938, he deserved a title shot with Alexander Alekhine. Okay, but let's go on to the next game. And I'm just looking at the decisive games for now. I just wanted to show you that one draw of this round, but a decisive game here. So Milan Vidmar against Max Euwe. So d4 from Vidmar. Okay, so d5, c4, c6, and we have a repeat of a popular Slav defense line. So even back then it seems there was some theory associated in particular with the Slav defense, even back in 1936. So this line looks very much like an Alekhine over World Championship match line. Queen c7 repairing a quick e5. White prepares to exploit this quick e5 with the move g3 for this pin, which seems to be quite annoying for black. So bishop f4, knight fd7. So we've seen it looks very, very similar to past theoretical lines we've seen in the World Championship matches. Queen c1, f6, white castles, bishop e6. Okay, so white exchanges on e5, and this next move actually turns out to be a big problem, potentially. Maybe I shouldn't say that. Sorry, a5 is potentially a big problem. It's either a strength or a liability. At the moment it is threatening to cause structural damage, but if it's fixed down, is that a5 pawn going to be a weakness later? Black does play a6, so is this pawn a problem? Because black will have moves like bishop b4. The b4 square is in black's black's holding that b4 square quite comfortably. We see knight e4, but on the other hand white seems to have dynamic pressure with knight c5 coming up, which is really annoying in its own right. Bishop b4, knight c5. Bishop drops back, seemingly passively. And Vidmar plays a move which would seem to have at least dynamic prospects. He sacrifices the a pawn here. He plays rook a4. Okay, what can Max do apart from take on a5? Bishop takes c5 looks unpalatable here. The king hasn't castled. Why do you want to do this? So he takes on a5. Okay, asking why. Okay, what's the punishment? Knight d3 is played. Black castles. So where's the punishment? Bishop e4. Okay, there seems to be an eye on h7, a bit like the Botvinnik game. What is this about h7 in these games? Well, there are pawns on dark squares. h7 is a light square target around the king. Is it such a big deal? What's the point of winning a5? Well, actually, one point of winning a5, black has access to the b6 square. That's quite useful. Bishop b6 here, it's eyeing f2, it's pinning down the f2 pawn. Okay, queen c2, seemingly eyeing that h7 pawn with renewed interest. But now here's a classy move, unbelievable. Unbelievably modern move. Unbelievable. So black seems to have a problem with the h7 pawn. Black seems to have been materialistic, taking on a5 just to have this bishop on b6, and now he's going to pay the penalty. How can he defend his king side here? Also, this rook seems ready to swing across if needed. It looks like a sort of towel-like position where black's going to get slaughtered any moment now. But there's an unbelievable move that black plays here. If I give you 20 seconds, I wonder if you can spot it. If I take away these arrows. What does black play? Anyone? What do you think black plays here? Okay, the suggestion for h6, Falbano and Dummer, Jean. h6? You think h6? h6 wasn't played, okay, but let's have a look at h6. Say black does play h6. Okay, what's the problem here? Is there any specific problem with h6? I see one potential snag. If white wants to play on this diagonal, potentially bishop e5 for check here, for winning this bishop. I don't know if that's a big deal or not, because the rook's holding up the bishop here. I'm not sure that's such a big deal at all. Can anyone find anything stronger to h6 if I give you a chance here? A few seconds. Anyone finding something strong for h6? Oh, I think I found something. I found something myself. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. So if no one comes up with something, I think I've got something here. I think we have a good tactical move here for white. Maybe it's bypassable. I was just thinking bishop h7 is dangerous if it's white turn here, but maybe not. I mean, maybe king h8. That is interesting. What does white play here? Okay, but anyway, black adopted a more radical solution to the position. He played actually g5. You know, possibly h6 doesn't lose. Okay, unless someone wants to engine check that and tell me the results later. But black played g5, defending h7 like this. But white is looking at this loose piece and plays bishop takes h7 anyway. Black doesn't want to go into a discovered check, so he takes for the queen. And now we see bishop takes e5. And it's apparent here that queen b3 check is on the cards. And in this position, Max decides he doesn't want to take on e5. He preserves his bishop. He gets that loose piece out of the way with bishop a7. So we're still equal on material here. Knight and bishop versus the two bishops. Stepped out of the queen b3 check. Okay, is black doing okay here? Equal on pawns. Black has the bishop pair. There's a slight snag with white's position. Potentially these light squares look a bit drafty. And now we see actually bishop c3 and this move b5 attacking the rook. And these light squares are starting to look even draftier now. Because after c5 it looks as though this bishop is cutting across the light squares, and this represents a dramatic transformation in the position, because it's not the fact that the queen's just got h3, it's actually got queen e4 as well, and this starts to look like a lot of danger for white on the light squares in this position all of a sudden. Not only that, there's the space gaining move again, c4 with this pin on the knight. So somehow the position's been transformed. Black is gaining all the space, has the bishop pair, and has access to these light squares all of a sudden. So queen c1, squeezing now with c4, and now bishop b7 with huge threats. Queen e4 is the principal one. Queen h3 is another one, and this pawn's pinned. There's no f3s. So this is pretty dangerous stuff. You look at these raking bishops down these diagonals, they're pretty dangerous. Okay, so white in this position is probably completely lost, in fact. If I give you a chance to look at this and appreciate that g5 somehow has pushed back white on the defensive. White plays knight f3, but the position might have been completely lost already, because g5 now affords g4, another powerful forcing move. And okay, you might think, well, knight h4 stops queen h3, doesn't it? Knight h4 does not stop queen e4, to which there'll be no defense. This would be end of game. Queen h1 is threatened. The knight's covering g2 fine, but it's not covering h1. There's no f pawn movement. This is end of game, this position. So white tried actually knight g5, and now, okay, it's covering the e4 square, it's covering the h3 square. Black just reacts with queen h5, and now again we've got tons of threats going on. The queen, you know, on knight e6, I think there's queen d5. If knight f4, we just mate on h1. Whoops, we just mate on h1. Okay, so it's hopeless. And in fact, after this move, white resigned. So a really dramatic transformation occurred tactically. So Max Euwe's not a bad player in 1936. You know, what a crushing transition. Let's have a look at that again. So it seems white wanted to whip up some sort of dynamic attack by sacrificing the a pawn. So this a pawn sacrifice looks like an interesting idea, because in principle it looks as though the rook can swing across. Okay, so black's going for the a pawn here, and then we see knight d3, and this idea of bishop e4, as though there's potential nasties for the black king here. But we see all of this seemingly being parried by this move g5. Okay, so it just turned around the whole position, g5, it seems. Bishop takes h7, maybe not be the best in retrospect. Maybe bishop takes e5 was better. So bishop takes h7, queen takes, bishop takes e5, black sidesteps queen b3 check, and now the white pieces get pushed back. This bishop on this diagonal is pretty nasty. So b5, c5, and all of a sudden it's black's really in the driving seat. This queen is ideally placed as well. So a remarkable transformation, ending abruptly here. Move 29, white had to resign. Oh, that was an interesting game. So okay, let's go on to another game of the round. Okay, Lasker against Bogoljubow. Okay, so Bogo. So let's have a look. Lasker against Bogo. So knight f3. So Lasker's getting on a bit in this tournament, but nevertheless he's quite a good player. So c4 e6, d4 knight f6, fm I'll call him, knight c3 c6, bishop g5, knight bd7, Cambridge springs, d takes, white gives up the bishop voluntarily. Okay, will the knights grip the squares? Will it be the dark squares or the light squares? Let's see what happens. Rook c1, knight d5, bishop d3, black takes on c3, b takes, strengthening white's centre. FM is not concerned about the inertia of these central pawns, it seems here. White castles, black castles, f4. Okay, g6, knight e5. It looks really comfortable for white at the moment. f6, bishop's kicked back, e4. And in fact, this f5 looks a bit of a menace for black's kingside. Just this f5 threatening to smash through black's kingside. So we see here the move trying to get some counterplay maybe with c5. Okay, it looks a bit on the provocative side. White does go in with f5. Okay, is this knight a target? b5, kick the knight. Knight e3. C takes d4, c takes d4, queen b6, trying to expose this centre. Bishop e2, protecting d4, rook d8 attacking d4, rook d2 defending d4 again. And saying, so what? I've got my centre and I've got my attack, where's your counterplay? White does seem to stand nicely here if black cannot exert more pressure on the centre. So black now plays king g7, and white with the move strengthens the centre. bishop f3, and also threatens our e5. Rook b8 getting out of the way of e5, and the king sidesteps this diagonal, making way potentially for d5 now without that pin. a5, and white reinforces the f5 pawn with g4, and there's tactical ideas now like e5 and g5. a4, and we see in fact the move e5 being used. Okay, what is going on here? Isn't this knight loose, you might wonder? Didn't black think he was preventing this? F takes, D takes. Well, if the queen took, we have as an option rook takes d8. Surely we have rook takes d8 here. The queen's protecting d8 at the moment. These huddled pieces are not doing much for d8. Rook takes d2, queen takes d2, giving white a chance to protect the e3 knight. And it does look a little bit on the nasty side. E takes looks a little bit dodgy because of knight d5 here, attacking the queen and the bishop. But that might even be much stronger. Black actually pins the knight, which looks tempting. Rook e1. And white, it has got this idea of f6, if nothing else. And if e takes, then we have knight takes f5, rebounding on the pin to take on g5. So for example, e takes, we have knight takes f5. We can take this g5 thing. So black hasn't got it easy here. He plays actually bishop b7, trying to expose this diagonal. White takes on b7, check, king g1. Queen f3 still looks dangerous, this pin maybe, but f6 also looks dangerous. And we see the move queen d4, just protecting g4 as well as e3. So f6 still looks dangerous. We see an unusual looking king h6, but f6 is played anyway, so potentially dangerous pawn here. Rook f8, and now knight g2, as though h4 might be on the cards for g5. That looks quite embarrassing. h4, rook c8. h4 might not work here tactically now because of something like rook c2. So this is dangerous, a bit of draft around white's king. So white has to do something quite quickly, and he played actually queen d7, which threatens mate in 1 with queen g7. So okay, rook c2 is now not playable. The rook stumbles back. And now we see queen f7. And where is black's attack? Where? The rook has to be moved now, or protected. And fm chooses queen a8, protecting the rook. But now comes this h4. h4 is nasty. Bishop d2, because now we've got g5 on the cards. In fact, g5 here looks pretty good, but there's a question about the king maybe making a run for it down here. So maybe Lasker's not that keen for the check here, unless the king is really getting mated. It might, I don't know. It looks as though the bishop's covering f4, so maybe the king's survival chances are improved. If we go crazy trying to check the king, let's just check this out. Then you can imagine this king with king h3 is going to be quite amusingly threatening white's king. If there's nothing concrete, this is a bit dangerous. On the other hand, h5, or maybe we just take. No, it's too dangerous, isn't it? I don't know. Maybe just rook h8. If h5, rook h8, I know this position, is it lost? There's queen d3. No, it's queen d3. But anyway, what we see in the game is actually rook d1, he avoids this g5 check. He plays rook d1, which is, I guess, a lot simpler, because if the bishop moves off this diagonal, if the bishop moves off this diagonal, then we simply, I think, can just play knight f4, threatening g5 mate with no hassle. So actually, after rook d1, we see queen c8, which doesn't really help now, because the queen also had to defend g8. White just takes on d2 here, and black just resigns, because there's not enough checks for black. If he did this, the knight's actually protecting f4 here, so white can just take this rook, and there's nothing. Forget about g5. This is all over. So yeah, I think he just so Lasker got the better of Efim with just simple move rook d1 here. Black seems to be overloaded. Okay, the rook's tied down. Obviously we've got queen g7 mate as usual. So I don't know, there's not much to do for black. His king safety has been shot to pieces. This pawn is like an attacking piece. This is no good. Okay, so now there's one more interesting game of this round I'd like to show, perhaps, if anyone's keen. One more game, or should we just carry on next week? Or for completion, for a sense of completeness of the interesting decisive games, I think I'm going to have a go at it. Okay, Theodore Tyler was playing Tartakower. Tartakower was very well known for his chess quotations, and he plays a bit more. He plays very aggressively actually with black in this game against Theodore Tyler. So knight f6, we see this is kind of the lion variation setup of the Philidor with black. Tartakower playing black. Now with h6, white plays just resolves the tension here with d takes e5, and a lot of players will be concerned maybe about playing such a move that they're giving black an easy time on the dark squares, like c5 access. Okay, queen e2, c6, a4, trying to prevent b5, queen c7. I think black goes optimistically crazy now, because after knight c5, white plays a move which I guess we can consider slightly surprising. Bishop e3. He's blocking in protection of his own pawn, but the king's in the center. But black goes completely crazy here with the move g5. Is g5 at all justified? I mean, would anyone here play g5 in this position with black? If I gave you 20 seconds, would you consider g5 a move here for black? Interesting. I mean, I guess optimistically g5 does hold down the f4 square. We might have a maneuver like this, and we might have the g5, but this is all a bit... This kind of plan doesn't involve this rook much. I mean, it's quite committal, and white's got this like d-file potentially. So this g5 to me seems a little bit optimistic. Unless you need to mate people quickly if you're in a chess cube war zone, that's a different story. But g5 generally is a little bit optimistic. Okay, and white simply reacts with a boring move, just solid and sensible rook ad1. We see the knight being pinned. Okay. And the bishop just retreats back to c1. Well, he's provoked this crazy g5 move, so why not? And also, of course, you know, potentially we've got manoeuvres against f5 here. This f5 is a little bit weak. Black plays knight e6 as though, yeah, he really wants to get that knight to f4, but it's just snapped off here. Bishop takes e6. Okay, black's got the bishop pair, but white now has got a lot of pressure in this position, especially this diagonal, actually, as it turns out, and c5 is often quite a nuisance for black. Bishop e7, knight e1, which is actually a really good positional move, knight e1, as we're about to see, because after bishop g4, f3, and now look, there's battery, queen f2. So the knight getting out of the way of the pawn to go to here, we're causing some concerns for black. If we rob black of the bishop pair by exchanging off dark square bishops, then we can go back for the c5 square with a knight maybe later. Black protects the c5 square, b3, but white still has a5 to try and blast his way through on this diagonal, and in fact he uses that now. a5, and this could even need more preparation, but black just takes the pawn. Bishop c5. Is this knight really a menace on f4? Well, it's challenged with knight d3, and then we see this optimistic, aggressive, you know, play, rook g8. Does white really need to take this knight and suffer any attack? He takes on e7, and actually after king takes, that would have held the e5 pawn, only temporary, because actually we have queen c5 check. This e5 is a liability. So actually this is a bit nasty. This c5 square, which was undermined, is causing the downfall of black here in this position. What is going on now? White's winning e5. Knight takes e5. Thanks very much. Where is the compensation? These pawns are fractured, diced. Tartakower plays queen b4. Okay, that knight moves. And now another optimistic move from black, bishop h3. White's not really going to take here to allow a fork of king and queen. He can take on c6 here, attacking the queen. Queen b7. You know, black's pieces are all waiting around for something here. But we just see queen c5 now. And what are the main threats? Well, it seems quite easy to play for white. He's got access to e5 again with his queen. It just looks really horrendous in many respects. Black actually tried, he didn't bother trying to take on g2 here. He actually just played rook c8. We see check, and now taking on e5, attacking the queen. Queen moves. And of course this g takes h3 is still on here. It's been a bit of a disaster for black. White now takes on h3, and there's not much compensation for being a piece down. Check. g4. He's trying to get the other rook in, try and get coordination of these pieces, but I don't think it's enough. Knight c5. Still a piece up, and on any f2 just the king would step in with king g2. Takes that f3 pawn anyway. He's just a piece up. So black's play's been a bit refuted. It's no point looking the rest of this game, but for those interested, with a piece up it's quite easy. Okay, so that was it. So yeah, Tartakower went a bit crazy there from what seemed to be a Philidor lion type thing. So playing again, my favourite Tartakower quote is the one about Reti. Sorry, what is the one about Reti? I think one of my favourite Tartakower quotes is the winner of the game is the one that makes the last but one mistake. he's got some amazing quotations which often carry a lot of truth, but I think he played a bit optimistically against Fyodor in this game. If we wanted just a quick reinforcement of this game, it was like if you want to play for a hack attack with black, this wasn't a good idea. I do wonder in this position about knight takes e4. I can't help but wonder and think, should I mention this or not? Would white take here, or is there something stronger? I wonder if just bishop b6 or something leaves black struggling in this position. So this was already a bit of a nuisance for black anyway. So this g5 crops up. Strange. And it's very, very committal for black to play like this. White's prepared to give up the light square bishop. And this is an excellent positional plan, though, that it turns out that here, even with black with the two bishops, this diagonal is white's major asset. And this knight e1 does play on the diagonal to kind of create this battery and make use of the a pawn as well. So that all turned out to be very, very nice for white positionally here. Once he gets access to that c5 square, you know, this e5 is dropping now because king takes, we have queen c5, and then he just falls to pieces really. So black's position is a bit of a wreck. Tactically here, let's say bishop takes g2 just out of interest. I guess, I mean, can anyone see a quick refutation? I want to just check. And something here. Knight c5 looks nasty. So we can give up that knight for knight d7 check. The king's got no g7 square. That'll be winning the queen. Yeah? And there's no major thing for black going on here. So it just fell to pieces, didn't it? With this c5 square, then the e5 pawn dropping off. So bishop h3, it's a lost position. This is pretty nasty for black's king. So he loses a piece, and then it's not that hard after. Okay. Okay. I think that's enough for this week. So I hope somebody got something from these games. I'll upload to YouTube as usual. So okay, see you next week then. Thanks very much. Hope you got something from it. Have a good week. Thanks.